Tonight's talk is a continuation of the book In Love with the World by Mingyur Rinpoche. I am starting with chapter 5, Let Wisdom Arise. And the theme of this chapter is ego suicide. He kind of starts with that, and then he goes into identity death. Talks about shamatha in insight meditation and monkey mind and inner wisdom. And then he also touches on open awareness and the recognition of awareness. So I'm going to start out with a quote. They're easy to find quotes in this book as far as I'm concerned. This is on page 35. Once we move from the belief that things are unchanging to the experience that everything is transitory, the tension between our expectations and the reality as it is begins to dissolve. Then we can know that the disturbance of this moment will pass. And if we stay with the recognition of awareness, the problem will transform on its own. Needless to say, this is easier to quote than it is to practice. But the idea is that we solidify things and feel that unpleasant situations are going to last forever, or they're just plain not going to change, or we cannot tolerate them long enough till they do change. He talks about our natural home, and this is something that he comes back to throughout the book. There are a lot of different themes that he keeps coming back to in the book. And so one is our basic natural home. And it is our mind liberated from all familiar concepts and associations. And it is as he describes it, a between state. It is an edgy, uncomfortable, sometimes frightening, awake state. It's spacious, it's empty. It has this aware quality. He uses the word cognizance or knowingness. Another way to put it is your awareness is aware of itself, of awareness. It's aware of being aware. There's no other subject than that, just being aware of awareness. So he's on the train and he is aware that he is very uncomfortable, that it's a very difficult situation for him because he's never been in anything quite like this before. It is so different than what his experience has been in the past. And now he spent considerable time. He grew up in Nepal and parts of northern India. And he lived there after he was an adult. And so it wasn't that India or a train in India was foreign to him. It was the class of the train fare that he was in, because he would always be treated the very best. He would go, no doubt, first class. And I can tell you my experience from airports in India. I've never taken a train ride, but even in airports, if you have money, you can escape from, you might say, the chaos of everybody else that is flying. And believe me, if you can fly in India, you are relatively wealthy. Whereas with trains, almost anybody can afford to take a train. So he is adding fuel to the fire, is the phrase that he uses, by doing this, because he knew that this would make him uncomfortable. He knew this would be edgy for him. So he tries to center his mind by doing shamatha meditation on sound. And in this case, he uses the train wheels, the sound of the steel wheels on the track. And so he just rests in the sound without commentary, letting emotions come and go. It isn't attempting to stop the thoughts or the emotions. It is just let them come and let them go. And when you get distracted and start following the thoughts, just come back to the sound, in this case, the sound of the train wheels. After that, he said after about 5 minutes of that technique, he was ready for open awareness of the sound. And with this one, the exercise was to not focus on any particular sound, but just to be aware of whatever sound catches his attention. Remain in awareness by letting go of whatever sounds have caught your attention. Don't dwell on them. Don't think about them. Don't think about identifying the sound or trying to put a past on that sound or a future on that sound. No judgment, no commentary. And he said after that, quote, my expanded sense of self grew bigger than the problem. That's on 37. I have used this example, and I think it's quite appropriate. I've used this example in my teachings in various times in the past, that if you have a bee, let's say a bumblebee buzzing around in a phone booth with you, it's a problem because there's no space. It's very claustrophobic in a phone booth. However, if you have a bumblebee in a very large auditorium, it's not too much of a problem unless you've got a phobia about bees. And then if you're outside in a meadow and there is a bee around, you might say the bee belongs there. And again, there is plenty of space to accept a bee. So that's what he's talking about here, is that by meditating first on the sound of the wheels and then open awareness, it allowed his mind to settle down and to have a more spacious experience of his mind. It isn't that his mind became bigger, it is just that he became experiencing the vastness of all of our minds. So on 37 is another short quote. Our awareness is our greatest treasure, and we already have it, but we do not know it. So then he gives the story, and I've heard different versions of this story. It's a very good story, and I think that's why there's so many different versions of it. It's about this couple that lived in abject poverty, and they just lived in a hovel. And one day a treasure hunter showed up and looked around there. I'm not sure what kind of a hovel it was, but it wasn't much, but they did have a fire pit in the middle of it, which means they had a dirt floor and there were rocks in the fire pit. And he looked at the rocks in the fire pit and he found one and he said, "This has gold in it. And I'll take it with me, but I'll come back then when I can sell it and I will give you what I sold it for." So the couple had no problem parting with it because they thought it was just a rock to begin with. They probably didn't even believe him. But after a while, I'm not sure if it was weeks or months or what, but he did eventually come back and gave them gold. And they were then the richest people in the village. The point of the story is that our minds are like that our minds are actually the most precious treasure that we have, but we don't realize it. We really don't realize the qualities that our mind has that we have not experienced yet. So there are a lot of different names for this mind. Another one is wisdom mind, the natural state, on and on and on. There are probably 30, 40, 50 different names for it in Tibetan Buddhism. But it all means the same thing, that we have a mind, and as a result of it, we are incredibly wealthy. And there takes a certain amount of faith and trust to really understand this. And until you experience it, you really can't totally appreciate it. So he makes 2 points next. The first is that shamatha meditation lets the mind calm down so that we can see beyond monkey mind. We can see this wisdom mind. And that insight meditation is a tool that helps us investigate it more thoroughly and fully. And the monkey mind is just that ordinary mind of ours that is constantly, you might say, talking to ourselves, telling you things, saying that it's afraid, that it likes this, that it doesn't like that, jabbering, jumping around. They use the idea of monkey mind because, like a monkey, our minds jump around from one thing to another, to another, to another, and never really sits very still for long. It was quite, for me, a big realization, I think, when I first started getting involved in meditation, was when I would listen to my favorite songs, favorite music, and realize I wasn't listening to my favorite music. I couldn't listen to it for more than a few seconds before my monkey mind would take off, and the rest of the song I would be lost in all kinds of thoughts. So that is our monkey mind. The second point he makes is that we need to make friends with our monkey mind. That this is a big part of his teachings, is making friends with monkey mind. If we dismiss monkey mind, in his words, it's like owning a car but not knowing how to drive it. That we're not trying to suppress monkey mind. We're not trying to deny monkey mind or destroy monkey mind. We're trying to make monkey mind our friends, get to know our own mind. but we don't have to take our monkey mind's advice. We don't have to be led around by monkey mind. So he also finds, because of his meditation and other techniques, that he has moments of relief, and then he'll go back to anxiety and discomfort. So he goes into now an analysis of ego, and he quotes his father, who the quote is, "Only with the death of this ego can we know freedom." So he has a discussion of ego. Starts with a definition here on 39. Ego or ego self is frequently used to describe the self-centered, fabricated outer layer of self. He then says it's actually more like a process than an object. In our confusion, we tend to solidify it, but it's more of a process. And it's characterized by grasping and holding on to fixed ideas and identities. Frequently, teachers will use the word solidifying things. Solidity. Now he says there is no ego to kill. But what does die is the belief in an enduring, non-changing self. If we look at the ego as something that is solid, that has to die, it actually strengthens the belief in the solidity of ego rather than weakens it. He also says we need a healthy ego. And in reference to that, he uses these three terms: intuition, discernment, and instinct. So it is knowing right from wrong, the difference between protection and harm, what is virtuous and wholesome, and also having inner wisdom that we can follow. I think another word for this healthy ego would be a provisional ego. The way we look at ourselves, but seeing it not as something that is solid, permanent, and so forth, but this is who I am right now. And this is how you might say, navigate through the material world or the world of relative reality. Another example that I have used is that if we start thinking about emptiness and egolessness and so forth, and forget about relative reality, you could find yourself in this situation, which is obviously totally absurd. But if you think that your body is not real, and that other outer objects are not real, then you can go out on I-94 with impunity and sit in the middle of the road And a car that is not real will hit your body, which is not real, and you will suffer a lot of death and pain, which is not real. But we need to take into consideration a relative reality, but not get hung up on solidifying things. He also mentions that we just can't let all our previous identities die at once. In various places in the book, he talks about different hats. And that's just another way of saying we have different roles that we perform in during our lives. We can be a child. You can be 45 and still be a child to your mother or your father. You can be a father. You can be a brother. If you are a female, you can be a mother, a sister, a daughter, and so forth. And then at work, you are an employee and a fellow worker, a team member, or whatever. And on and on. You go into the store and you are a shopper. But you have more identity than that, than just being a shopper. You have other ideas about yourself. But anyway, we bring in so much that we talk about as being our ego into all different situations. And we have a certain way we want to present ourselves and others to perceive ourselves. And so we really can't have, he's realizing that he can't have all these identities of his disappear at once. That he says he grew into them and he needs to grow out of them. Meanwhile, he is thinking that I'm totally overwhelmed, or my monkey mind at least is totally overwhelmed by aversion to the surroundings and to the people. Quote, I knew that if I really wanted to become more flexible, I would have to drop down to a place beneath the separation of heart and mind. This is on 41. So this is where wisdom comes in and his previous training. So he does a meditation on bodily sensations, starting with the breath to relax his body and his mind. Then he does insight meditation on change and impermanence, starting with his own breathing and his own body and his own sensations, going up to the universe, which is totally and constantly changing. And then he finishes up on 41, quote, I took my mind off the sensations and just rested in the awareness itself. The alive, sentient quality that registers sensations with a pristine clarity beyond concepts. So this is actually very similar to the sound open awareness meditation that he did, where he just focused in on whatever sound caught his attention and then let go of it when another sound caught his attention. Needless to say, conceptual mind can't understand this quality of pristine clarity beyond concepts. So then he gives meditation instruction. There's a lot in this chapter. I spent a lot of time taking notes on this. So stage one, the common mistake at the beginning is that meditation is supposed to be peaceful. And this is dualistic. We want a peaceful ocean with no waves. And when the waves come, and what the waves are, of course, are thoughts, emotions, feelings, whatever, urges. They come and we see them as threats. And so we try to push them away, try to subdue them as a second strategy. The third is pretend not to notice them or to deny their presence. And the fourth is to use conceptual arguments based in emptiness frequently to reduce the threat. So it's good to take a look at yourself, to look inwards and see if you do any of these things, if you react this way when you're meditating, when you start having these waves of thoughts and emotions. The second step is an experience of a bigger perspective, more spacious perspective, that you have experienced resting in spaciousness, this non-conceptual aspect of mind. But there still are waves, of course, and so they are still seen as a problem. There's more room for them, but still they are a problem. You're just not as reactive. So he says, going back to that quote that I mentioned before I got into this section on meditation, that the understanding of emptiness is dropping from the intellectual head to the experiential feeling heart. So it is, you might say, trying to open up to your heart and not pay so much attention to the thoughts that you are having. You still get stuck in the waves, getting carried away by the waves, and the feeling of spaciousness comes and goes. But again, it goes, but then it comes. And by not trying to grasp onto it or run after it or recreate it, you might say deepen your meditation experience. So the next stage of meditation as your practice develops is that the waves are no longer a problem. Again, the waves are still there, but they are seen as just small waves on a vast surface of the awakened mind. So this is a connection with our own awareness, and it protects our mind from obsessing on thoughts and emotions. We're aware of impermanence. We can let it be, let it pass. We know that it will not stick around. It came into existence at some point in time, and it will pass. So the basic instruction is whatever arises in the mind, let it leave. And this level is attained by ceasing to make the surface calm. Just stop trying to attain calmness. Just accept that the nature of mind is change, and you're all right with that. Observe these waves as the play of the mind. when you understand this, you have inner freedom, that you can experience stress and anxiety, but still have this calm mind underneath the whole thing. It does not completely throw you off balance. There is a saying in the 7 points of mind training, which is, if you can practice well distracted, you are very well trained. And that's what is being talked about here, that we have the waves. They might momentarily distract us, but they don't throw us off. On page 45, quote, "We are liberated from suffering by correctly perceiving reality. This means that if we have the insight and experience to know that our minds are so much vaster than we generally think they are." So that is the key, is really understanding the true nature of our mind, even if it's just a glimpse. Even if it's just reading and hearing about it, but having confidence and trust in what you read and hear. And he gets at this in another way too. He talks about contemplating impermanence and change to help us understand that what is happening around us is constantly changing, not solidify it, and to spend more time focusing on this spacious sky-like mind, which does not change. And he mentions, as I said, the importance of paying attention to what his teachers taught him and trust in his own experience. But he also mentions that this becomes more important as you travel the path. As you progress on the path, your relationship with your teacher and trusting your teacher becomes more and more important. And also trusting yourself and having confidence in yourself becomes more and more important. He ends up with a question, what will I do in the bardo? And what this is about is, it's about change. He's not talking about dying and what happens at the point of death, but he is talking about the fact that because of impermanence, things are constantly changing. That things are actually constantly new, and since they are constantly new, the old has been constantly dying. He mentioned things that us ordinary people can relate to, the change of a job loss, divorce, serious illness, children leaving home, death of a beloved one, a house fire. My neighbor had a barn fire a couple of weeks ago. So the seeds of rebirth are in all of them. Something will come from all of those. And his question to us is, can we trust that rebirth exists within every moment? So that's how he ends that chapter. Now I'll get into chapter 6, which is, what will you do in the bardo? And the meaning of this title On 49, here is the quote: "What will you do when you experience your life as being interrupted by undesired circumstances? When you get what you don't want, when you don't get what you do want." Needless to say, this is life. Another word for this is life. But he lists things here: frightening sounds, crowds, a reeking train, war, terrorists, ill health, a flat tire, the perception of being slighted, disrespected, rejected. And it goes from really big things to really little things. So he says the key to life is to familiarize yourself with your own mind, and that meditation is the best method. That with meditation, we can accommodate whatever appears to our minds. He then talks a little bit about the traditional teachings and meaning of bardos. And bardo means interval or transition. And it is, you might say, framed by impermanence. Impermanence is one of the main teachings of the Buddha. And in a way, it's one of the most difficult teachings, because it means that everything is constantly changing. There's nothing solid to really grab a hold of. So the traditional bardos are the bardo between birth and death, the bardo in sleep, the bardo when you are meditating, and then there are the bardos that are associated with death. There is the bardo of dying. It starts with the irreversible dying process. It doesn't start when you first get sick and then 4 years later you die. It's very close to the time of death when it becomes irreversible, that nothing can be done. The next is a bardo of dharmata. And this is the bardo of the peaceful and wrathful deities. That seems to be the one that most people know about, or the one that is most commonly known. And these deities that appear are actually manifestations of our own mind. They're not projections that are coming from somewhere else. It's actually our own mind that we are seeing. And then the sixth bardo is the bardo of becoming. And this ends with birth. The time to prepare for these last three are, well, we're alive, needless to say. We can't prepare for them after we die. So the time is this life. But he also sees these bardo teachings as referring to an inner journey of the mind. And this is how his father taught him. So he doesn't spend too much more time talking about them in the traditional way. He goes back to this in-between state of mind between one thing or another, that's a bardo. He also talks about it as being a gap. And so he says, one example would be a traumatic experience. Having an experience that leaves you frightened in an unfamiliar place, you might say, emotionally. He says, any experience that, quote, knocks us off our feet could be considered a bardo. Where is there is the death of something familiar, and now we've been knocked off our feet. He uses the description of it's like falling, grounding, going down, losing it, desperate to get back to solid ground. So he says the railway station was an experience like that for him. He's trying to help us understand that what he was experiencing was actually universal. We all have, you might say, our own railway station experiences. Something that just came to my mind was driving in the wintertime on very icy roads and all of a sudden losing control of the car, where the back starts to fishtail. I hope none of you have had that, but perhaps you have, since you're from this part of the country where there's a lot of snow and ice in the wintertime. But that can really give you this feeling of helplessness, panic, and so forth. So he says that the bardo is understood in his usage to be this very moment, the nowness of this moment. This in between. He doesn't say past and future, but I think that's a good way to put it. In between what just finished and what is happening right now, in between, has not come to an end yet. And we really don't know exactly where it's going. He says this can be both temporal and spatial experiences. He says the tiny halt that exists between this breath and the next breath is a bardo. And interestingly enough, he says that it's space that provides definition for objects, for experience, and so forth. And what came to my mind when he was talking about that was, I remember Louis Armstrong talking about jazz. And he said that it's not the notes that are so important, it is the space between the notes that is important. And if you know anything about jazz, it is because that space between the notes is changing, a lot of times in unexpected ways. Frequently delightful if you like jazz. So Mingyur Rinpoche says there is always a gap. A gap is natural. That there is always change, that it's extremely unrealistic to expect that we will not change, others will not change, that things will not change, that relationships won't change, that the bardo these teachings about the Bardo show the transition is always happening throughout our present life and over many lifetimes. The challenge, he says, is to let go of our narratives, our stories, our soap operas. That we need to become familiar with our minds and work to have stability so that whatever bardo we are in becomes an opportunity to wake up. And that kind of echoes the bardo teachings, like in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because they are focused on the person that has died waking up. So he is saying that we can wake up in this lifetime without dying, and that our lives are constantly dying and being reborn. The old is constantly coming to an end, and the new is arising. So understanding impermanence at a deep level, impermanence as the quote, immutable condition of our lives, is crucial. If you read any of the books on Mahamudra practice, it starts with thinking about contemplating impermanence. And speaking of Mahamudra, the last paragraph of this chapter is about Mahamudra, this resting in the recognition of pristine awareness. That this pristine awareness is always there. He said he's had glimpses. In his words, mostly free from the waves of experience. Short moments. And he says the idea is to practice regularly for short periods of time, but many times during the day. And he finishes up by saying he benefited from this training in the past, but they were within the familiar places, that there were protection from being disturbed and so forth. And it had safeguards. He finishes up this chapter by saying, this, on the other hand, was very real and intense.